just like to start off by introducing myself. A lot of you probably know who I am because we have done a series of these for the past many years for Depth Psychology Alliance. My name is Bonnie Bright, and I founded Depth Psychology Alliance in 2010 as a place, a location online where anyone who was interested in depth or Jungian psychologies could come together and really be able to find what information they wanted about depth psychology and about their own healing process or psychological process. But I also really wanted it to be a place where like-minded people could find one another, because at the time there was not a lot of this information online. And of course, that has changed radically in the last 14 years since that has happened. But it is really just so endearing to me to know that some of you guys have been involved in this process of connecting for probably almost as long as we've been doing that. And so grateful for those of you who have been feeling and experiencing that connection. And then more recently, in the last 3 years, I founded the Institute for Soul-Centered Psychology and Coaching. And there I have been running training programs for people who are interested in becoming or certifying as soul-centered coaches. There's also a certificate in soul-centered psychology, or you can just audit it without having to do all of the requisite stuff. And I will just say that the way that I define soul-centered is all of the psychologies that are related to the unconscious. And that, for me, also makes them more of the spiritual psychologies. I'm assuming that most people that are here online with us now are not offended by that word spiritual. It definitely has a lot of different connotations in our lives, in our culture. If you were raised religiously, you might have some negative connotations to it. If you were raised religiously, you might have some very positive connotations to it, but it definitely means something different for everyone. But what we will discover as we go throughout today and moving forward is that the spiritual component is absolutely requisite and might, in fact, even be inherent in our psyche to seek that spiritual connection. So I'd like to maybe launch us at this point. That's enough about me. Christoph, maybe you can jump in and introduce yourself.
Yes, thank you, Bonnie. This is, in fact, where I live. I am very, very fortunate, and I know you already hate me for living in paradise. I am a neuroscientist who's taken you could say late interest, but passionate interest in neurospirituality. And I will play the role today of what science, both materialistic science and non-materialistic science, have to say about both chaos and consciousness. So I'm delighted to join Bonnie today and provide that echo in our conversation on these fascinating two topics.
Thank you. Well, let's just jump right in and talk about chaos to begin with. I assume that most of you have an interest and are actually here, or perhaps if you're watching this at a later date, you have an interest in chaos, maybe because chaos is actually affecting you in some way in your life. Maybe you are feeling the chaos that's in the outer world. I suppose that has always been the case for as long as the history of humanity, but it does seem particularly up for us in today's world, maybe also because we are all so interconnected through social media and media in general, and we can just see and have more evidence and more visual evidence of what is going on in the world around us. But certainly there are a lot of things that are happening that are very unsettling. If you are interested in climate change at all and are following what is happening with that, it's quite scary to witness the rapidity with which things seem to be falling into a new pattern. And we will talk about patterns in this process. But I'd like to invite you to type into the chat now, if you have managed to find that, what is something that you associate with chaos? You might look at this as like what got you here to this, if you're experiencing chaos in your own personal life, or it might be something that you are experiencing in the outer world. I'm not asking you to name a particular situation, although if that is what comes to your mind, then that's fine. There's no right or wrong here, but we're just trying to bring into this space all the different perspectives that we can get that have or are related to chaos as we begin to dig into the relevance and importance of engaging with chaos, of almost taking it in our hands and being able to turn it over and over as we look at our relationship with it. So this is great. I'm noticing what's coming in here. So Disassociation, yeah, that can cause a lot of chaos in our lives. Chaos is a fertile compost. I like that. You're already way ahead of us. That's wonderful. Good one. The potential for being, fertile earth, colliding energies. Wow. Yes. And those colliding energies can be very scary and disconcerting if we don't have a ground to stand on or something to hold on to when we are experiencing the midst of that chaos. And so that also is a big piece of what we want to talk about. Anger definitely can be very chaotic, whether it's somebody around you or you're experiencing or the target of somebody else's anger. But wow, it can also create a lot of chaos within us when we find ourselves in those states of anger and we don't even know how we got there, or here we are again and we don't like to be there again. The dynamic feminine, definitely the feminine is associated with chaos. That might come up somewhere. Lack of synchronicity. Oh, that's a good one. Well, I hope that we get into some complexity theory where we might actually discuss that. Busyness and dissipation of energy, definitely for some of us, that dissipation of energy is a little bit like a dissociation. Catastrophic disclosure of the reality of UFO, UAP, non-human intelligence on the planet. That might cause some chaos if that actually comes to pass, but not for everybody. So we are also going to talk about how we can be individuals who are pillars in the midst of chaos, how we can hold ground for other people around us so that things don't come crashing down as we get more and more overwhelmed in our society by these notions and experiences of chaos that we have. Accidental trauma and the devastating domino effects, absolutely. And I suspect that almost everybody that is here present or watching this probably has some understanding of trauma in their own lives, whether it's large, what we would call acute trauma, that's very obvious, something that happened, or whether it's what we refer to as developmental trauma, which may seem like small things, but guess what? When we're little kids and our ego is developing and our ego just wants to help us feel safe and help us feel seen and acknowledged and accepted into somewhere where we feel like we can belong, our ego is going to get really, really scared when there are unpredictable things happening. And so our ego has to take on coping mechanisms, whatever it can find or feel into in the environment that it's in. It adopts certain coping mechanisms to help us to be able to deal with certain things that are too much for us to bear in that moment. So that could be something that's overwhelming our psyche in that moment. If we're 4 years old, and even if mom says, no, you can't have that right now, even if she's kind when she says it, we can still perceive that as a rejection, and that can still be taken as a sense of rejection. And it may point us toward a pattern in our lives where that sense of rejection actually starts to push us in a direction of personality. What do we do every time we feel rejected? Some people might, make themselves more present in that moment or more in a place where they can be seen and noticed. Some people might actually withdraw from a situation like that and minimize their needs so that they don't have to experience that kind of rejection again. So you can start to see how chaos and our incapacity to tolerate it can actually cause problems in our lives. And so our little ego at the time, which is just forming, and it is an organ of consciousness, by the way, our egos are, but the ego has really dedicated itself to helping us to navigate our lives. And so we're also going to look at the relationship between ego and consciousness, and the relationship between what I like to call our soul self instead of our ego self and consciousness. So we'll go more into that in a bit. I'm not going to scan through the rest of these. Oh, there's only 4 or 5 more, so you guys will have a chance to do that. Christoph, would you like to launch us more into our discussion about chaos and what you feel like it means for you? What is your definition of it, and how do we come at that from a neuroscientific standpoint?
Yes, of course. As you know, I never travel or do anything unless I carry a brain. I just wanted to give you a short introduction of this wonderful organ, which is only 3 pounds, 1.5 kilos, with about 86 billion neurons forming pathways. You hear about the circuitry of the brain, and that's been the subject of my obsession for a few decades. How do we respond, and how can we evaluate, as scientists, the direct effect of handling chaos? In many ways, the source of a lot of psychological disorders are correlated with chaos more than the ultimate benefit of chaos. And that is because in our brain, we have automated mechanisms to respond without really much intervention of our higher level of consciousness. For instance, we don't really have one brain. We have two. We have a primal brain, which is survival centric, and we'll tend to look at chaos, at situation where we feel threatened and our life is at stake. And so those mechanisms, of course, are managed largely by what's called the autonomic nervous system, i.e. the part of our nervous system that is trying to find and equalize to a state of homeostasis with our environment, especially, but also inside. So the study of chaos and its effect on the brain has been mostly looking at those pathologies, anxiety, stress, depression, possibly addiction, or even trauma. What has been very interesting, though, is the recent opening for looking at the brain in ways that is not dictated by what we can measure necessarily, but what we can assume. And that is a lot of our states. The eco state obviously is very well understood. It generates an enormous amount of energy grab on our entire brain. And that is why in my research, I found that as long as we are under the dominance of ego energy, we're basically short of energy that we need to step out of the prison in which both the primal and the ego self tend to put us. So this is a lot of information already from a neuroscience perspective, but the point that I will try to make is that most scientists, and especially neuroscientists, have very little to say about the spiritual level of our consciousness. And the reason Bonnie and I do this work is to actually bridge more so the science perspective with the soul-centered perspective. With that, I'll let you add what you want on consciousness and what it means to address that from a soul-centered perspective.
Thank you, Christophe. You know, I think that every one of us can identify with what happens to us when we are presented with chaos, when we are in the midst of chaos. And I'd just like to invite each of you right now to just tune in to something that feels like chaos to you, just taking a moment and letting something come to mind. I don't know if you're particularly bothered by something right now in your personal life or something that is happening in the world around you, but you can note what happens in your physical body, in your soma, as we call it, in the somatic body, when we consider something like chaos. And again, I was mentioning those coping mechanisms. Things have to be sorted and put into some kind of an organizational pattern in order for us to be able to feel safe. Our ego, because it is basically tasked with keeping us, has set itself on that task, I guess I should say, keeping us safe and helping us to feel seen, it has a very hard time tolerating chaos. And so when you can tap into that and you start to feel some of that discomfort that usually comes along with chaos, or perhaps when you tap into it, it even manifests as fear or a sense of anxiety. We see a lot of stress and anxiety, and of course, associated with all of those is depression, because in modern society, we don't really have containers that can help us to navigate the chaos that is existing already. Christophe, I can see a couple more people coming in the waiting room. Would you mind letting them in? So one thing that we can look at in nature is that actually beneath what might appear as chaos, there are patterns that are underlying everything in nature. And that in fact, what we seem to believe is reality is not the only reality, but there is something that is underlying everything. And that everything is what we look at normally as the world that we live in. It's matter, it's mass, it's our interactions with the world that we go in. But what we know from quantum theory is that matter is only 4% of the known universe. So what is that other 96% of the universe? Well, again, quantum physicists can tell us that it is not empty space just because it looks like it is. There is actually something there, that everything in the world that we can see, everything in the universe that we can perceive is actually held together by a kind of glue, or we might say it's embedded in some kind of an energy field. Everything is energetic and everything is in relationship with everything else. So we begin to get a feel for how maybe that underlying order that Jung talked about, that the physicist David Bohm talked about, that Rupert Sheldrake, if anybody knows of him, he's a biologist from the UK, that underlying our reality are patterns. There are forms, there are structures that actually give order to the universe, and therefore nothing, in fact, is chaos. If we can know everything about a system, there is no chaos. We can see that there is a pattern and everything would be predictable. Now, in any system, in complexity theory, for those of you who are familiar with that, there are always going to be things that happen that are introduced into a system, what we call a perturbation, which then causes the system to disintegrate and to break apart. So if we start to look at that from a psychological perspective, we can understand that in our daily lives, there are going to be things that happen to us all the time that start to break up the little system that we have developed and have protected so carefully to try to help us navigate in the world. Those coping mechanisms, our psychological way of viewing the world, what makes us okay to be in the world. And we can start to see that when something comes along and it perturbs that little system that we've got going on, everything begins to shift and change. And that's when chaos can actually start to manifest in our lives, or it's when we start to feel or believe that we're in chaos. But guess what? Out of chaos comes order, because underlying everything is that so-called implicate order. Underlying everything are those energetic patterns that make up our known universe. Mass, really, if you want to, I don't mean to be too reductionistic, but if you look at mass, really what a lot of the theoretical physicists are saying is that it is simply where more mass has been condensed and condensed. And as more particles gather in a particular place, it takes on a particular structure that makes it look a certain way. And from there, we can start to identify patterns that are at work. So let me just give you a couple of examples, and then I'll give that back to you, Christoph, in a few moments. But one example would be, if we look into nature, look at the caterpillar. So a caterpillar, at some point in its life as a caterpillar, begins to have these hormonal changes, and this instinct kicks in, and it begins to create these silk threads, and it begins to weave its own cocoon. And if that caterpillar could know what its own cocoon was going to be about for it, maybe it wouldn't want to do that. But what happens is, once a caterpillar has completed that cocoon and they're inside, it disintegrates almost completely into like a form of goo. Like there's just nothing that's in there. And for those of you who have experienced some difficulties, some challenges, for those of you who have ever been in something that feels like what Jung called a dark night of the soul, the nekya, sometimes we have to be in these processes that feel like chaos because the old structures they're not the be all end all. That caterpillar probably could have gone its whole life and been a caterpillar and maybe never known anything different. But as you know, once that goo begins to shift and change, there are these things called imaginal cells. And you can imagine what an imaginal cell might be. But those imaginal cells are what hold the blueprint for what that caterpillar is going to become. So one imaginal cell will kind of start to become the antennas, and another imaginal cell will start to become the wings, and another will start to become the body. And I would like to offer that we have access to something a little bit like these imaginal cells. Oh, maybe it's even through our imagination, because Carl Jung always used to say that the soul speaks in images. And so if we have access to images, which can come through our imagination, this is one way that we can begin to interpret the patterns that are at work in our lives. So the second thing I will say about that before turning that over to you, Christoph, is that Jung posited something which most of you on this call probably already know something about. He posited the idea of the collective unconscious. And we might look at the collective unconscious as kind of the implicate order, or that underlying reality, that energetic quantum field from which all things emerge and then begin to organize themselves into patterns. And the collective unconscious, as Jung said, is made up of archetypes. And what are archetypes? Well, they are patterns that can be recognized across time. So all cultures and all eras can recognize an archetypal pattern. What does that mean? Well, it's because it's almost like shorthand, right? It's an idea that has been condensed into an image, basically. So like if I say mother, I don't have to describe or define mother to you. You guys all know what mother is. Now, your mother might be completely different than my mother on a personal level, but mother, the idea of mother, carries this archetypal theme around which we all understand. Mothers are usually the nurturing ones. They usually are the ones that give birth to the baby. They usually are the caregivers. They have feminine qualities. There are certain things about mothers that are generally accepted as part of the pattern of mother. So as we find ourselves in relationship with chaos, whether it's in our personal lives or whether it's in the outer world, what's going on around there, the call for each of us is to be able to look inward and identify what are the archetypal patterns that are at work right now. How can I perceive those? There are ways to do that, and we'll talk more about that as we go. And how am I in relationship with those patterns right now? Am I living out the archetypal pattern of a victim because of what my childhood was like? Am I living out the pattern of a hero where I feel like I want to save everybody? Am I living out the pattern of a leader who can step up in front of everybody and say, let's do this, let's go this way? Am I living out the pattern of a perfectionist who knows that they can be accepted and belong in the world as long as they can hold an ideal and work toward that ideal on a regular basis? Some people develop the pattern of people pleasing, right? Because that is one way that we can try to make sense or make order out of the chaos. But these are patterns that also can be changed. And sometimes in our progression, in our evolution, our psychological evolution, have to be changed. So what that means is we have to face chaos in order for those structures to come down and then something new to emerge out of that chaos so that we can tap into the creative force that is our inherent right. So I'm kind of giving you a little bit of that and an understanding that from chaos comes consciousness. I have a little bit more to say on that. We'll see if we have time, but Christoph, I'd like to turn it back to you and see what you've got from the neurospiritual side or neuroscientific side.
So we discussed briefly that consciousness, in fact, is verifiably playing at multiple levels. We talked about primal consciousness, which is essentially automatic responses that often create maladaptive behaviors like stress, anxiety, or depression. We talk about the power of the ego to rule many of our conscious behaviors. A lot of that is hosted directly into the newest part of our brain called the cortex. But what's become more and more obvious is we have the ability as humans to transcend and raise consciousness. And I suspect many of you have learned, whether it's through meditation or the safe and responsible use of psychedelics, that you can have these big bumps of consciousness that magically give you the perspective of understanding the extent to which you are trapped into those coping mechanisms. So Bonnie and I have done a lot of research and retreats around teaching modalities that are designed to raise consciousness so that we then take advantage of neuroplasticity. Neuroplasticity is our innate ability to rewire our brain to deconstruct those pathways that potentially could be responsible for stress and anxiety and addiction, for instance, and really reframe the narrative around what is going on at a neuropsychological level so that you can basically rewrite your story. And there's a lot of excitement in neuroscience in general, and of course in the study especially of psychedelics, because it is very clear that the point of the rays of consciousness is not just to have this new way of understanding your behavior or your toxic habits, but to rewrite them. And so I find that chaos, in its ability maybe to scramble the default mode network that is responsible for the ego, is giving us a chance to step out of the straitjacket of our ego.
Yeah, so I'll just pick that up and maybe turn us toward Jung again for just a few moments. Many of you know that Jung studied alchemy for over 30 years and often called it the culmination of his work. It was really his most important work that he did, that he considered. He only studied it for over 30 years because he only discovered it halfway through his life, and that was really all the time that he had to dedicate it to it. But in alchemy, which most of you know as the capacity, or I guess the search to figure out how to turn base metals or lead into gold on a physical perspective, when Jung learned about alchemy, when he was about halfway through his life, something just resonated with him about alchemy. And he really was able to see it in his own imagination as an amazing representation of our psychological process and what we're doing here on this planet. And so I would submit to you, there is a question: what are we doing on this planet? Well, Jung believed in the soul. We are talking here today about consciousness. So I'd just like to offer us a model by which we can look at our lives and how we are navigating our lives, how we are in relationship with what's happening to us. And so in this moment, sorry, Christoph, one more to let in. In this moment, I would just like to offer that in alchemy, we usually start with what is called the prima materia. And the prima materia is our beingness, our coping mechanisms, our experience of the world in a psychological process. Where do we go from there? Well, there is a process in alchemy called massa confusa. And so once we are in that process of transformation, because that is what alchemy is all about, that massa confusa comes up, and that is almost like a scrambling again of those systems by which we then have the capacity to identify how we can be in relationship with what is happening and how what is happening is in relationship with us. This is the notion that many of you know about panpsychism, the notion that everything is alive, that everything in the universe is consciousness, that those quantum fields that we can't see, that we can only conjecture about, that we emerge out of those quantum fields. But the question is, how and why did we get here in this form? And why is it that there is so much suffering? And how is it that we can engage with the world, engage with our lives, engage with what's happening in our lives, and be able to have enough understanding, enough grasp of what's going on that we can actually make ourselves useful in the sense of being able to almost stand up in the midst of chaos and be able to hold space for what is going on in the world, because we are able to identify that there is something bigger at work here for us, and it is actually for us on our behalf. So if you believe, again, just coming back to a model that I'm offering, if you believe that there is some kind of consciousness that goes on after our physical death, and a lot of people in this space particularly believe that, we certainly have a lot of at least qualitative references from people who have had, say, near-death experiences, who can suggest that there is something that happens after physical death. There are times when scientists have noted, doctors have noted, that the body is completely shut down, the brain is completely shut down, and yet people come back when life-saving techniques are used on them, and they have memory of things, or they have the capacity to say, yeah, I was kind of viewing what was happening from the ceiling of the operating room where I was. We know that there is some evidence, at least in that way, of life after death. So if we are conscious, or if there is consciousness after death, if somehow we re-enter that field, then perhaps there's consciousness before birth. And if that is the case, then perhaps as that consciousness, we made a decision to come here, to be on this earth, in this world of form, in third dimensional form, to have the experiences that we can only have as human beings. Now, I'm imagining, and because there was a mention of UFO, UAP in there, thank you for that, I'm imagining that there's a way in which being human is the only way that we can, for example, have access to the five senses. Or maybe there's a way in which, as humans, we have access to interpersonal relationships. These are ways that we can grow. If the universe came from the Big Bang and it's always expanding, then why would we not always be expanding our consciousness? And so perhaps we chose, as that consciousness, to come down in some form, and that we are all emanating from that same consciousness. I like to think of it like an octopus, and at the very tip of one of those tentacles, there's me. And maybe there's 8 billion tentacles on that octopus, all coming out of that one consciousness. Each one of the tip of those tentacles is having its own experience of what's happening here. And if that tip of the tentacle can actually see and understand that we came here for a reason, again, I'm not asking you to buy it if it's not resonating with you, but if this is a model that you can work with, if we can understand that we came here on purpose, that we had a choice in the matter, that there is a plan, that maybe our soul, as we call it, and I'm using soul interchangeably with Jung's collective unconscious, maybe we would even call that the divine. We could call it the universe. There's a lot of different names for that, but it is a force that is presumably larger than our ego force, right? And so if we did decide to come here and we had a plan for ourselves, almost like picking a major at college, right? You decide what you want to major in, what you want to do, what you want to work with. And then maybe we had to kind of put that plan into action and say, well, I'm going to need a mom and a dad who can start wounding me from day one so that I have something to identify with and then something to birth myself out of. But if we start with that as a premise, then nothing can ever be completely chaotic, because what that means is that implicate order, that underlying order that is the reality that we all came from, actually means that we have to have challenges. We have to feel the chaos in order for us to grow. And that means anytime we're experiencing chaos, there's a reason for it. And all we have to do is ask ourselves, what is here for me to learn? What is here for me to be in relationship? What is being asked of me to change so that I can be in relationship with my soul self in a completely different way than the ego that is just constantly trying to shut things down so that it can feel safe and feel seen? And that is what leads us into some distress. So I see where we are time-wise. Christoph, would you like to say a few more words and then we'll open it up?
Thank you. Wrap things very, very elegantly, and I can't imagine a mere neuroscientist can elevate the conversation as you have. So I think it's a perfect time to open the conversation, and I'll let you manage that process.
Okay, great. Thank you. And if you could just help me keep an eye on the chat too. Sometimes that's hard to do two things at once. As you know, as a neuroscientist, we cannot multitask as much as people can. That's one of the things my ego thought it could do for the longest time. And I'm finally starting to come to the understanding that actually that's just an egoic thing. I'm trying to control things and it just doesn't work that way. So yeah, so you guys can type questions or comments into the chat. Totally fine with that. If you would like to say something, please feel free to, if nobody else is talking, feel free to just unmute yourself and you can go. You guys are all on multiple pages for me, so I may not see you if you raise your hand, but if you'd like to raise your hand first, you can always just put your hand up like this. There is that function. And of course, now Zoom is so smart. There's a pattern at work. There's an algorithm that says when you raise your hand like this, it's going to automatically pop up your hand electronically. Isn't it crazy, the world that we are living in? So you can see everything is interconnected, right? And the unfolding of that implicate order maybe that's one thing I'll just say as we're waiting for questions to come in. Let's see, does anybody have their hand up, actually?
Yes,
No?
Carrie does.
Okay, great.
And Gloria.
Okay, great. So Carrie, why don't you go first?
Yeah, hi. Thank you, Bonnie and Christoph, for this really amazing conversation. Thank you for putting these two things together, because it's something that I always, wonder about as well. And one of the questions I tend to ask myself when I work with this stuff is what would Jung have thought of some of the advances in neuroscience that we have right now? And I guess that's my question, like what do you think? So I'm familiar with sort of Jung's answer to this question, how we deal with this chaos, but what from a neuroscientific perspective would you guys say are some of our sort of options or approaches to confronting chaos?
I'll take a quick stab at it. I'm definitely not a Jungian expert, but I do know, most of you probably do, he was a medical doctor, and so was Freud. And so their eagerness to decode our behavior was coming from a very rigorous scientific perspective. At the time, however, we didn't have functional MRI, we didn't have EEG, and therefore the measurements were mostly associations that people would report in their dreams. It was extremely difficult to document and ultimately create this kind of mathematical formula of what consciousness is. Today, among neuroscientists, the problem of consciousness is known as the hard problem of consciousness. And I had, for decades, the ambition that I could measure everything, until I finally caved in and admitted that this pursuit was both ridiculous and limiting in my ability to understand. I don't know if you have anything else to add to that, Bonnie, but unfortunately, I can't say much more than we're just scratching the surface from a neuroscientific perspective and trying to actually recognize the brilliance of Jung and others that did need a functional MRI to really establish some incredible narratives that help us all heal and understand who we are.
Yeah, that's great. And so just picking up on that too, Jung in his very early days, as part of his work as a psychologist in the budding field of psychology, I guess we wouldn't have called him a psychologist at the time since he was a medical doctor per se, but what we can understand is that he was conducting these word association tests. So some of you who know Jung well or know his history well will remember that that is the way that he identified what he called complexes. And so just for our purposes here, a complex is, the way I look at it, is almost like it's this tangled knot. Talk about chaos, right? Complexes are chaotic representations of those either acute or developmental traumas that we experienced in our early life. Wounding is another way to call that. And we develop those coping mechanisms I was mentioning earlier from those woundings and those traumas. And then what happens is those coping mechanisms or those complexes just begin to take charge of our lives, and they fall back into our own personal unconscious, and we don't even remember or know that they're there, and yet they are driving our actions every moment of the day. Now, Jung used word association because he would say a word to somebody, and then he would gauge the amount of time it took for somebody to respond to that word, to that triggering word. And if it took people a little bit longer to respond to it, then he felt that there was something there that was emotionally connected to the individual, and he could then foresee, he was looking for patterns, right? So he could foresee that there was something there that he called a complex, which is when somebody triggers that particular wounding in you, there is some kind of a response or a reaction that is usually more over the top, that shouldn't be required. But at the same time, it's because it's something that when we were small, we really didn't know what to do with. And it also felt like a matter of life and death to us when we were little. Because again, if we were rejected, who was going to put food on the table? Who was going to put a roof over our heads? Who was going to take care of us? Who was going to just give us the basics, let alone the love? And of course, we will do anything for love as little kids. We'll try to find it wherever we can get it. And so those complexes, although they come from a sense of chaos, although they look chaotic, we can now, through understanding of Jungian psychology and other soul-centered psychologies, we can understand that those complexes can be worked with, particularly in 3 ways. And these are the 3 ways I have adopted and put them together in the certificate program that I teach. And that is, we can look at things somatically. That means we can find things in our body that actually are available to us, energies or feelings or sensations that represent something unconscious. It can also be symptoms if we're not feeling well, or if there's something that is, going on with us physically. And those are representations of something that has happened to us in the past. But if we can get into those and work with them and come into relationship with them, because everything is about relationship in this scenario, right? If we can come into relationship with those energies, those memories, those driving forces in a certain way, then we can change everything. The second way, I'll just say quickly, is symbolic. So as I mentioned earlier, Jung said that images are the language of the soul. He practiced active imagination, which is really engaging with those images that arise. And then the third way is shamanic, and that is using techniques that allow us to enter these expanded states of awareness or non-ordinary states of awareness, where we can access that implicate order or that unified field of reality, the information in the collective unconscious that everyone now has access to. We just need the tools to know that we can. We need to even know that it's there for us. If you haven't discovered Jung yet, or you're not that interested in psychology, you may not even know these things. And so, yeah, I think I've probably said enough about that. You guys know about that. Carrie, is there more that you would like to follow up on with that?
No, that's really, really fascinating. Thank you. I guess my question was just, and maybe it's just too broad a question, related to like what sort of, are there any tools that neuroscience is currently looking at that helps us sort of approach any of those levels, somatic, shamanic, symbolic, in a way that's sort of more expedient, like fast tracking it in a way? Because this work
I
can take a
will maybe
lifetime,
add just briefly, because I know Gloria is waiting to talk.
Yeah.
There is, I feel, an exciting time in combining multiple disciplines to the study of consciousness, and not to bring everything back to the study and the importance of psychedelics, but when you go to the MAPS conference, which is the body taking care of the legal work, which is enormous, to get MDMA and ketamine and other modalities approved, has gathered neuroscientists, medical doctors, psychiatrists, nurses, psychedelic facilitators that have been working underground for decades, right? And so there is a renewed energy where I don't think the solution is going to come from neuroscientists at all. I think it's going to come from the collective and plastic energy from people who are willing to question and debunk all these old stories that we've come to believe about who we are and how we can explain ourselves. I know it's probably not the clear answer you wanted, but that's where I am personally. I'm super excited that finally we're looking at this from a multidisciplinary perspective.
Thank you.
Gloria, do you still want to participate?
Yes, thank you. Yes, I was really quite fascinated by your concluding remarks, Bonnie, about having chosen this life. Because I had an experience many years ago where I went into like a spontaneous vision where I was a pinpoint of consciousness just floating in this black void, and my attention was drawn down below. And I saw a woman who was pregnant, and I knew this woman, and I knew that I had to be the child that she was pregnant with. And I came out of that vision, and with that, I kind of had a life review of my relationship with my mother, and like all the incidences of my mother, and it just made total sense that I had chosen this woman as my mother. Now, the struggle I've had with that is that there was a lot of trauma in my life. So if I chose this life, then I chose all that trauma. And I had huge resistance to that. The resistance has gradually been worn down as I've worked through the trauma. But the other thing that kind of is a sticking point for me is this idea that I made a unilateral decision, when it's obvious to me that any decision involves so many, it's just an intricate web of decisions. So do you have any remarks on that?
I do. Christophe, do
You.
want to jump? Those are great observations and questions. Thank you, Gloria. Christophe, do you want to say something first, or shall I just jump in?
I think you should take this one.
Okay. All right. So don't get me started, right? So I love that you shared your experience with us. Thank you very much for that. That was a really remarkable experience. And I can see how, at least from my perspective, perhaps that is an example of you being able, through that vision that you had, to identify something that was not necessarily in your awareness before. So I don't know what your relationship was exactly with your mom, but all of us, I think, again, you said it, and so I'll just back that up and say, yes, that is what I believe, that we did choose our traumas, that we did choose the challenges that we are facing. Maybe we didn't choose exactly every moment that we are living in our lives, but maybe we have like these jumping off points. Maybe there are kind of checkpoints along our life that says, here's where you have an opportunity for growth. Okay, we're done with that one now. Let's move into another one. And that's why I always like to say, whenever something happens to us that it feels really difficult and we're suffering a lot, what's happening is this. And for those of you who can't see that right now, I have my hand all the way up to the camera so that all you can see is the palm of my hand. But when I pull that back, look at what you can see. There's this whole world out here that we didn't even have any inclination to see when my hand was up there. And what I would suggest is that our ego is what gives us that view from just the hand. It can't see what's beyond that. It gets caught in the complexes and it gets wrapped up in those challenges that are coming at us. And then what can it do? But when we can introduce this idea of soul, when we can access through some of these non-ordinary states of consciousness, through some of these tools and techniques, things like breath work, or things like ecstatic dance or yoga or meditation, you guys can probably name hundreds of things that can put us into those expanded states of awareness. But if we can understand that everything that happens to us is happening for us, then again, it gives us that opportunity to say, and I ask my clients this all the time when I coach them, when they're going through something difficult, I always ask, why do you think your soul self might have given you this experience right now at this time in your life? And guess what? If you can go through your life asking that question, it gives everything new meaning and perspective. And it allows us to be able to survive long enough for something new to emerge out of what is going on there. Out of the chaos comes consciousness, right? And one of my favorite quotes from Jung ever, he says, in all chaos, there is a consciousness, and in all disorder, a secret order. And of course, he knew this stuff. And of course, he understood that, our ego, if it cannot let anything else come in, if it does not seek out that relationship with the divine, with the soul, then it cannot see that there is meaning or significance in what is happening. And that's why we suffer. But if we can see when we're caught in that and we're caught in it and it's really, really hard, if we can just say to ourselves, okay, what's here for me? And then guess what? We have to surrender, because that is a process of trust where we say, I'm in the alembic right now. That's the alchemical vessel, right? I'm in there, things are swirling, things are being added, I'm being changed, I'm in the cocoon and I'm turning into goo. But if we can just hold it long enough, something new can emerge. And guess what? That is also Jung's idea of the transcendent function, right? We just have to hold, we just have to tolerate what's going on long enough for something new to emerge. So if you guys are stuck in something and it's really, really, really painful, just keep going, but take care of yourself in the process, right? We really have to take care of ourselves so that we can be in a safe container and have the nurturing that we need while we are trying to outweight that problem. If it's not shifting and you're just desperate, it's about the soul's timeline, right? So that's also something we have to surrender to.
We're getting to the top of the hour. I want to make sure we invite Paul.
Oh, yes, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I greatly appreciate you creating this Eranos roundtable, so to speak. And I really like what Glory was saying there in terms of, in putting it in context. I've been rereading William James, and of course, his definition of the spiritual experience is one's relationship to the divine.
Mm.
And I think that, of course, the soul is that thread to the divine. And so that, again, that puts it in context. But I'm curious, and I'm wondering about, I think we need to do some relanguaging in terms of choice and decision. I think those are old terms. I don't think we really make a choice. Choice is an ego thing. It's a left brain thing. So we might want to re-examine. I don't think we choose for suffering in that sense, but somehow we get into that situation, so that we might want to look at relanguaging choice and decision making. But I think you're right on in terms of patterning and looking at all of this. And so I'm grateful to, again, bringing the soul back into this. And it's kind of a little bit like Hillman, revisioning psychology, bringing that sense back. But, it's the soul will do what the soul will do. But in terms of the chaos, I had put the thing up in terms of what seems to be coming down historically in front of us is a major shift in worldview in terms of the origins of humanity and our human spirit and our human soul. Thomas Berry, Teilhard de Chardin, and that's right, the sense of disclosure. Well, it's more than disclosure, but there appears to be other forms of intelligence and other forms of consciousness. What is galactic consciousness? And there's a whole, at the end of his life, Jung was very interested in UFOs, and there's a whole other discussion there. But anyway, coming back around to just grateful for you're seeking the depth, looking for the patterns. I think that's really, and the meaning of symbol is really, really good. And it's funny, I'm going back and rereading Jung now, 40 years later. I was in Zurich during the early 70s. And then to come back and now, to listen to von Franz on projection, her book on projection and some of the work, it's really it gives you a different perspective, the depth and the appreciation for the wisdom that all happened in that whole process. And so I gratefully appreciate you carrying on a legacy here. So thank you.
Yes, I really do appreciate all of those comments and agree with them completely. Yes, we are at time. So if anybody needs to drop off, absolutely feel free. We are going to wrap up in just a few moments. I would like to just acknowledge the comments that have come in and really appreciate those. Just that one last question, Christoph. I don't know if you've seen it on there, but it might be interesting to address it briefly, however briefly, from a neuroscientific standpoint. Olivia is saying, can we talk a bit more about the neuroscience of healing trauma, say for a prolonged season of being in fear from COVID or in a riot zone or a war zone? Chaos has occurred. How to invoke the template and fill in the fragmentation neurologically. Maybe you can just say briefly what you perceive is happening there and what can be done.
Yeah, I wish I could provide more granularity. It's a very complex question. I see neuroscience in general being far more interested in physical aspect of trauma, injuries, accidents, than spiritual. And there is a growing movement of medical doctors, psychiatrists that are finally really getting into understanding the very complex effect of trauma on our brain. Gabor Mate is leading the way in his wonderful books and his ability to go beyond the old model of materialistic science. So yes, neuroscience can deliver, but has not yet, in my opinion, as long as it's stuck in this idea of measuring everything, because we know that the direct effect of trauma goes far beyond physical pain.
Thank you. And I would just add, I mean, this also brings in neuroplasticity, which is our capacity to hold the tension of those opposites or whatever is going on and be able to really understand that there is something here that is important. It is not just to survive it, but in fact, these states are absolutely critical to our evolution. We cannot evolve if we are in a fixed, closed system where nothing new ever comes in. When something new comes in, then that system can evolve. But usually it doesn't evolve until that system breaks down because something new came in, and then we go into the goo or the dark night of the soul, and then that something new emerges. So I see our lives as just this constant. We go through something hard, an initiation, we survive the initiation, we come out better, stronger, more conscious, and then, oops, there we go again, right into that, another initiatory experience. But now we know how it works, right? We just have to be present to it and see what's happening and really try to do our best to hold the tension and to allow that something new to come in. And so that neuroplasticity, really, really, really important. If we are open to being super present in the midst of our pain and our suffering, which the ego is allowing or causing, then when we get super present, we're in connection with soul. We're in relationship with what is happening in a completely different way. And then that neuroplasticity allows us to see what is right here, right now, that we might have missed otherwise. Or if we had shut down something that was happening according to our usual patterns and ways of being, then what would we have missed that might have happened in that moment after we shut it down in our usual patterns of being? So all that to say, I think that there's a lot of potentiality here. I'm sorry we didn't have more time. We probably should have made it for a little bit longer, but thank you guys for sticking with us. I do want to say we are going to be offering a 4-week course. We haven't quite settled on the start date yet, but we will start unpacking all of these, hoping to give you guys a roadmap for your own path from chaos to consciousness, or maybe even more appropriate to say holding chaos and consciousness at the same time, because of course it's not as black and white as moving from one to the other, but it's finding ways to hold what is going on in your lives or how you are in relationship with things, and then finding what are the tools and the ways that we can actually move out of that chaotic situation, move out of the dark night of the soul or the Nigredo stage in alchemy and into the more enlightened stage where the light is coming in and the light of consciousness turns on. And then for those of you who have not seen that, we are also offering retreats on the Big Island of Hawaii. And those are usually going to be 4 nights and 5 days of pretty intensive work in some of these techniques and topics that we're talking about. So there's more information about all of that on the Institute for SoulCentered.com website. And if you guys have any questions, please feel free to reach out to us through our contact form on the website. Again, that's Institute for SoulCentered.com.
Thank you, Bonnie. And thank you all for showing up and raising your consciousness, doing so. That's just the way it works.